this topic. So the first one is, the current leaders of Iran, Khamenei and Ahmadinejad, belong to a sect that believes that the 12th Imam is coming in, quote, when the world is in chaos, end quote. The questioner goes on to say that the Middle East is in chaos. So are you nervous? Are you nervous that this is the same country that's very close to having a bomb that thinks that the Imam is coming and the world's about to end? Anything that's open to the panelists.
Well, let me quickly answer. If I take Ayatollah grandson Hossein Khomeini's perspective, I would say that 80% of the Iranians don't want to be around to see this thing happen, but they want life, they want freedom, they want to get out of that situation. It is the crazy Ahmadinejad, the Khamenei, and the people, who are using the Islamic totalitarian ideology for their own power. They have no legitimacy anymore, and these are the arguments that we're trying to control the people.
When I was doing my studies to get my MA in military history, I actually specialized on the Cold War and deterrence. And I think about that a lot when I think about the Iranian nuclear program. What scares me about them is that I'm not sure the Iranians are rational actors as we would understand them. The Soviets were. They needed their system intact to win. Do the Iranians need their system intact to win? Well, the people would prefer it to stay intact. But I will admit to being genuinely concerned by the idea of nuclear weapons being in the hands of someone who might not view mutually assured destruction as a bad thing.
Coming to humanity.
No, but just the idea of the instability. I mean, I won't speak to the coming of the Iman, but the deterrence issue, I don't know, call me old-fashioned. I like to think people with nuclear weapons are rational, even if I don't like them or agree with them. I can disagree with someone's ideology, but still understand the way they think. I don't understand the way the Iranian leadership thinks.
Yeah, I think it's significant that arguments that draw a parallel with the Soviet Union in the nuclear context break down when you think about Iran. This is a regime that marched into minefields, teenagers, boys and girls, I think mostly boys, age 12 and up, to clear the minds of their bodies. That's what the regime does. And it's done even more heinous things in the years since that war, which was the Iran-Iraq war. That does not strike me as the kind of regime that you can assume that you can deter through pressure and the traditional means. And I don't have a strong feeling about the emergence of the Imam and so forth. But what I take that to be is their statement of how serious they are about their ideology, their religious ideology. So if that's what the regime believes, and they're waiting for this state of chaos in order to see Judgment Day or whatever it is that they expect, that's not good news. What's there to say? I don't think this is going to be the pivotal factor about what we think of Iran. It's that their record is such already that whether or not the belief in the 12th Imam, whether that's prevalent or not within the regime, I don't think that's significant at this point. We already know enough to have a view of them that it is a tremendous risk for them to become a nuclear capable regime already. It's a risk for them to remain in power without nuclear weapons because of all the conventional means at their disposal already, terrorist proxy and so forth. So this is a terrible regime.
We'll take a question from the floor now, but before we start with more questions, let me remind everyone that the question period is for questions. If you begin with a speech, you'll be cut off, so questions only, please.
I want to thank all the panelists for coming tonight. The great statement that was made earlier that having these kinds of meetings and discussions is what's really important for freedom of speech. What I haven't heard from any of you, though, is speaking to the essence of Islamic totalitarianism. The fact that it is based on fear, that it requires the imposition of Sharia. It doesn't require statehood for it to be effective. It requires that it impose this as well on individuals wherever it is located. So what do you advocate to make it so that those who wish to leave the totalitarianism of Islam can do so without fear?
Okay, I'll jump in. I wouldn't necessarily say I have anything particular particular to advocate. I'm not sure I entirely heard the last part of the question. Were you saying what would we do to protect those who wish to leave? I just couldn't hear what you were.
What I was saying was that the totalitarianism of Islam doesn't require statehood. It requires this ability to be able to impose fear in wherever locality is located. It does through Sharia law. So the fear is imposed on individuals. What do you advocate in order so that individuals will be able to escape the fear of totalitarianism?
Well, abroad, I would say effectively nothing. I don't know how countries...
Not abroad.
You know?
Not abroad. In Canada.
Well,
in Luton. In Malmo.
I've already said that I would say my opinion on that is that we need to reinforce our own values and stick to them. I think everything we need to defeat a kind of Sharia-imposed totalitarian place is already in place in our liberal democratic values. The supremacy of the individual, of freedom of conscience, of political affiliation, of active engagement in society. All we need to do is actually stick to what we've already written down and pay lip service to. All the rules are in place. I mean, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is sometimes a cumbersome document, but it lays out pretty explicitly everything we would ever need to say to roll back Sharia law. The question is not whether or not we know how to do it, or if we have the laws in place to do it, it's whether or not we have the guts to do it. That's what scares me.
I would add one thing, which is, it's interesting in this context to look at Europe and the situation there, because in several respects they're farther down the road with this issue. So by that I mean there are more activist groups in Europe pressuring courts, pressuring the state, institutions like schools, and what they're calling for is de facto recognition of Sharia precepts, right? So they want the schools to segregate children. They want the schools not to serve pork. They want, and in the US, this is coming very gently relative to Europe. I don't really know enough about Canada to comment, but I think what's significant about Europe is that Europe really has a fundamental problem about what it stands for, and that's Europe is a broad continent, obviously, so different countries are at different stages of this issue. But they asked, I think this was in Denmark, they were trying to identify what does it mean to be a Dane? And I think they tried to make a video, and it was comical because they really couldn't pin down what their culture stands for, their civilization. And that is a different aspect of what you're raising, which is, do we really understand that when someone says you cannot criticize a religion, what they're meaning you cannot criticize Islam or their view of it, what they're actually saying is you have no freedom of speech, period. Because as soon as you let that be acceptable, nothing's off limits. Every ideology will be able to be shut down, every criticism. So we have to recognize what the principle is that is being challenged. So this isn't a matter, so one misconception is that part of the pressure is just for accommodation and respect. I don't have a problem with people earning respect and having their views respected. What I reject is the pressure to raise is Sharia law above Western law. But we don't see it that way. So that there's a fundamental conceptual issue of this is really what they're asking, and this is the law that we should uphold for these reasons. And that's a fundamental point that hasn't really been understood. And it goes back to the issue, do we understand the enemy? The enemy isn't just those people trying to blow themselves up and drive and fly planes into buildings. The enemy is what they're after, the goal of elevating their law, their views above everything else. So they might not do it by violence. And that's significant. It's significant they might do it through peaceful means for non-peaceful ends, meaning subjugation. That is a significant, this is another dimension of what I raised in the presentation, which is you have to understand what they're after, what it is that they're killing and fighting for, because that's what we have to counter. They may stop fighting, they may decide that, you know what, it's better to be doing what they're doing in Egypt, is run for office, you know, or take over through de facto recognition of, and this is happening in England significantly, where we looked into that. So this isn't a prescription for what to do tomorrow when you wake up in the morning. I wish I had something that concrete to give you. But I think a significant step is to make people aware that this is what's at stake. It's not somebody's feelings that are at stake about having recognition. This is a fundamental principle of our society that is being challenged. That's what we have to fight for.
We got a few questions about this, and this is in lieu of Israeli apartheid week, and there's been protests on campus. The questioner asks, how would you describe the acts of the Palestinian Authority and Hamas in the area of freedom as compared to Israel? How would you describe the acts of the Palestinian Authority and Hamas in the area of freedom as compared to Israel?
Well, as a member of the National Post editorial board, it might surprise some people who know I consider myself generally pro-Israeli. I find it almost to be a strange question in the sense of, there's a philosophical concept, and when I get into philosophy, I tend to get lost, so I'll make this quick. It's called a category error. It's asking a question so badly you can't answer it. And I think when we're looking at comparing Israel and the Palestinian Authority, particularly Hamas, it becomes very difficult. The literal answer would be, I would say Hamas's human rights and freedom record would compare badly to Israel's. I feel as though perhaps I'm letting you down by entering it as basically as that, but I consider the two regimes to be almost uncomparable. They have to learn to work with each other, but comparisons between them, particularly in the Gaza Strip, I don't know how to answer the question. I just find it so strange.
I'd like to chime in here. There is no comparison. They're not on the same axis. They're not comparable political entities. Israel is a regime, it's a state that recognizes individual rights. It is comparable to Canada in that respect. It has a lot of social institutions. It's comparable to the UK, where I grew up. It is a regime that you could recognize. If you landed there, you might decide you like it. Food's pretty good. You would recognize a lot of what you see here. There's a lot of high tech. There's a lot of low tech. There's agriculture. What is Hamas? What is the Palestinian Liberation Organization? Its leadership, Fatah. What are they? Are they really after some political end that involves a society that's peaceful? That's the question that we should ask. Because the record so far, and their own statements for the last 30 odd years and longer, is no. They're not after a better society. They're not after greater recognition of freedom, anybody's freedom. What they're after is political domination. It is the standard kind of thing in the region where there are dictators and monarchies and tyrannies. They happen to have become more Islamized with the rise of Hamas. What they want is enslavement of people. Look at the record. It's not an answer to the question, but I think the question is fair. I agree with you. It's not answerable in those terms. What has life been like under the Provisional Palestinian Authority, which is the pseudo-pre-state before the Palestinian negotiations are supposed to resolve, which I don't think will ever happen? It's hell. I mean, you don't know if the knock at the door is going to be the secret police, one of the multiple competing secret police organizations. You don't know if they're going to come. So you're a newspaper editor. Do you worry when you go to sleep at night that tomorrow the press will be burned down?
Last week, I called on a federal cabinet minister to resign, and I got to tell you, I never worried about getting shot in the back of the head doing it. I worried about getting disinvited from cocktail parties, but
it doesn't. It is so foreign that, and I just pointed to the fact of burning down a press. The idea of shooting people in the back of the head, as primitive and barbarous as that is a fact of life.
I think there are probably some people in the government who have wanted to do that to me, but no one who would even think it was possible. And I think it's the separation between the conception of what is doable and what is unthinkable. I mean, if there is a dividing line, perhaps that's it.
It's a gangster regime for the goal of domination. It is not for any... There is no positive end game for them. It is just a continual striving for greater and greater power. It's a destructive force. You cannot compare that movement and that cause with what you see next door. With all, I mean, I will admit Israel has flaws, it has problems. I criticize aspects of Israeli culture and politics strenuously. But you cannot ignore the fundamental, which is it is essentially a free country. You do not walk down the street and worry for your safety except for the suicide bombers. And who are they? That's what I want to add to that.
I was recently at the Yorkview panel discussion on this very question about Israel, apartheid week, and so on and so forth, that most of you students are aware about. That also happened in some small way in our own campus. I just pulled it out because I remembered the co-panelist, he had given me his card. The co-panelist was from Israel. I was meeting him for the first time on a table as we sat together. And here is his card. His name is Bahij Mansur. The only difference is that his spelling of Mansur, of course if it had been in Arabic it would have been no problem. It would have been Meen, Nu, Waw, Sin, Re. But in English his spelling is, he spelled it with an O, O-U-R, and I don't have an O in my spelling of the word Mansur. But there is Bahij Mansur. So he was an Arab Israeli. And we got chatting, and when in the midst of his own sense of little excitement to find another Mansur on his table, he kept calling me my brother from my tribe. And I reached out to him. I said, Brother Mansur, we both share the name, but I am not an Arab, so I couldn't be your tribe, but you really honor me. Later on, he told me that he was here in Toronto, passing through Toronto, and was headed to New York. And he would then be heading back to Jerusalem to pick up his papers. And I said, where are you heading next? He said, well, I have been posted as the ambassador to Nigeria. So I said, well, how are you going to work out your problems over there between the Igbos and the Fulanis and the Hausa and the Biafran? He said, well, and Boko Haram. So he reminded me. So that's a reflection of Israel. I mean, it would be wonderful if I could find, sitting across some member from an Arab Muslim country, Pakistan, Afghanistan, who would then give me a card, who would be, you know, representing one of these countries, or would be a member of the parliament of these countries, would either be a Jew or a Hindu or a Baha'i or so on. That's the answer of the problem that we're dealing with, you know. There's so much smoke and so much ignorance that it makes it a complete tripe to even try to deal with it rationally, talk rationally about it.
We'll have a question from the floor.
Yes. This question especially is for Mr. Journo.
Could you put the mic closer to your mouth?
Yes. Well, whatever you said about the Iranian regime is not even 1%. They can go far, far more. But this question, just like to, especially you, ask your government, any Canadian. There is a group which is fighting with this Iranian regime for the last 30 years, and their base is in Iraq. But lately, 10 years ago, American regime, they put their name on terrorism list. But European Parliament, they removed their name last year, and especially the English government removed their name. But I would like you to ask your government why their name is still in your list, because they are fighting for freedom. Yes, why their name is still in your list, Canadian list?
So the group you're referring to is, I believe, Mujahideen Kal. I can't say if I pronounced that correctly. I don't speak for the US government, I wouldn't want to, and I'm not here to defend them, but let me comment on your question, which is, why is this group on the terrorism list, given that you see them as fighting the Iranian regime. I think there are 2 points to make. One is, I don't know enough about the group to say whether they're completely in the right in terms of what they're after, whether they're just an enemy of my enemy and therefore we should be on their side. I don't have a strong view of that. But I think it's significant that the terrorism list that you referred to, and you can find this on the website of the US government, I think it's the State Department that publishes this. It is a mixed bag in that it does document actual state sponsors and actual terrorist groups, but it's also, and this is heresy, it is also a political tool. So let me give you an example outside the Middle East to illustrate what this means. So you may have heard that the North Koreans are back to the table now. They're willing to talk to us about their nuclear program. This has been going on for about almost 20 years now. One of the steps in the last 15 years was that as a condition of the last, third deal with them, which fell apart, was we would remove them from the terrorism list. So we removed them from the terrorism list. Did they stop doing things that we regard as sponsoring terrorism? No! they kept doing it. We put the Iranian regime on the terrorist list at the right time. It was doing heinous things well before we put it on the list. And so it's used as a carrot with a lot of these groups. You do something for us, we'll take you off the list. You don't do something, we'll put you on the list. So it's not a completely clean and pure statement of the actions of certain regimes. For the most part, some of them are clear-cut. Syria, no question. North Korea, no question, it belongs on there. Iran, no question. But then they put people there as a means of appeasing other groups. So I wouldn't be surprised if one reason that the Mujahideen Khalq is on there is because they want to appease the Iraqis. Right? The Iraqi regime is now very friendly with Iran. I can see that. Or they might be doing it for the Saudis. All of which is to say, it's a highly politicized list. You have to recognize that.
We'll have a written question. We got a few on this, but I think the essence of it boils down to, is there a double standard that Islamic regimes can impose a form of government on us, but during the Bush era we imposed a form of government on them?
Well, I mean, I certainly think you can say that's the case, but, when you try to impose democracy on someone, you're essentially imposing a free will decision upon them. And I'm a skeptic on the Iraq War. I think it was handled badly, to say the least. But I'm not sure you can ever say you're imposing democracy on someone because they can choose to undo it. It's pretty brutal to put it so starkly, because especially given that at least 100,000 Iraqis died. So I don't mean to sound glib with that, but when you give someone a free choice, can you be said to impose them? I think the greater issue that speaks to that point, where there are fair grounds to accuse the West of a double standard, is a point I was addressing much earlier in the evening, is our energy dependence on the Middle East forces us to deal with regimes we would not normally support. There is absolutely a double standard there. I just don't think the imposition of an attempt at free democracy is the best example.
I'll have a oral question next.
My question is directed to Dr. Mansur. In your earlier talks, you were mentioning how frequently you were separating Islam from the Islamicist totalitarian ideology. And you further mentioned that you want us to, as Muslims, to roll back Islamicism so that we can progress, as you mentioned, into at least the 19th century. Well, as Muslims, couldn't I argue that our stagnation economically and politically has occurred since the abandonment of Islam, and the downfall of the Ottomans, and the division of our territory? And that, as an observer right now, I see the West as a beacon of hypocrisy, as liars, occupation, capitalism is killing everybody. So can it not be argued that it's the Muslims' choice to elect these Islamic regimes as an alternative to the Western liberal democratic models that we simply don't buy into? Because clearly, capitalism is not working with Occupy Wall Street.
Is there a question mark at the end of that?
Yes. Yes, sir. That's all. That's pretty much my question. Isn't it that we should have the choice to pick Islam if we don't agree with liberal Western values?
Well, I don't have any problem if those are the assumptions that make up your sense of where you stand or the way you look at the world. Those debates should take place freely in Cairo, in Islamabad, in Tehran. When such debates can take freely, as it takes place in New Delhi, for instance, then we will say that yes, Egypt and Pakistan and Afghanistan, they have made some progress, however bad the West may be, and then maybe, you know, Egypt and Afghanistan and Pakistan might have something to teach us here in Canada, teach the Americans. But until that happens, all of what you're saying is merely rhetoric. It is simply smoke and mirror. It is simply to sound good. The fact of the matter is, you know, everything that you said just rebound back to you that those are just so much of self-delusion. If the Muslim world is going to make progress, whatever the definition of progress is, it's up to them. I completely agree with that. They have to show what democracy means and what freedom means. So unless they demonstrate that, and they can demonstrate that effectively, anything that is being said in the manner that you have spoken out is simply resentment, self-delusion, anger, self-loathing. That's exactly what I was talking about.
Two questions on this topic. Israel seems to be under more of a threat than it's ever been. Do you think there's any sort of reconciliation possible, or how can peace be achieved for Israel?
Reconciliation always takes place between free people. It doesn't take place between a free person and a non-free person. There can be no reconciliation. Well, the United States had to go through a second catastrophic struggle after it had gone through the first struggle of 13 colonies becoming independent. 47 years ago, to take the words of Abraham Lincoln, it had to go through a second catastrophic struggle so that the slaves could become emancipated and free. I think, in my view, and the young gentleman who posed that question, the Muslims have to become free. I mean, that's what Hussein Khomeini, the grandson of Ayatollah Khomeini, was saying. There is no freedom. And once the people are free, once they can discuss, once a Muslim like I am in front of you, sitting and talking about this matter, can freely discuss this in the Parliament of Pakistan, I wouldn't be alone, because it is the reason and rationality and the force of the argument that will demand a counter-response with similar reason and conviction and force of the argument. And as John Milton said, you know, there's nothing to fear between the conflict of truth and falsehood. One of the things that the political regimes of the Arab Muslim world are afraid of, first they're afraid of women. You see, they're afraid of half the population. And then they're afraid of their own people, that if they become free, these regimes will all collapse. It was one big self-delusion revolution that happened in 1979. The end result is what Khomeini's grandson is speaking today. Well, the Arab Spring is going into another huge, massive self-delusion. And out of that will come. They have to experience it, you know. I can sit and talk myself blue in the face, but my son wouldn't even pay attention to me. But now he calls me up and he wants my advice, because he's in his mid-20s. So they have to go through that experience.
That I think there's no reconciliation until there's an agreement that we have to live as civilized people. And that means barring physical violence, physical force as a means of resolving the disputes. And that is not on the table. I mean, the Palestinian cause has defined itself by virtue of using violence and force, and in many cases terrorism. Now, I agree with you. Maybe I'll be going a little bit, I'll take it further, which is the Palestinians in particular, since that was the question, they in particular need to renounce their cause and embrace the West. And I think that's true. That broadly, the more freedom, true recognition of individual rights, the more that exists in that part of the world, the better. And you'll see many fewer conflicts. I mean, there are many conflicts apart from the Arab-Palestinian-Israeli conflict. That's a sideshow in many cases in the grand scheme of the wars and conflicts. You'll see many fewer of those if the countries in that part of the world and the people see and the values of the West resonate with them. They don't right now, not enough. And that's really that's how you get resolution. It's a long process of education and political reform that has to happen, philosophical reform, before there's any kind of practical sit down and treat each other like civilized human beings and come to resolution of disputes like this one.
Just to jump in with my own quick thoughts on this, I would actually disagree with a little bit with the premise that Israel is under more threat than ever. I actually think Israel's security right now is pretty good. They have certainly faced periods in their history where their immediate annihilation was likely, not simply possible. We'll see where the Iranian nuclear program goes. That could easily become an existential threat. But right now, the Israelis don't necessarily need to fear for their survival. They need to fear for their legitimacy. And maybe down the line, that could imperil their survival. But that's a different point. To the issue of reconciliation, there will be no reconciliation between Israel and the Palestinians until it suits the Arab world to have that happen. Right now it doesn't. The Arab world benefits tremendously from dragging out that conflict as long as possible. I've never been to see the Arab countries complain about the poverty in the occupied territories. At the same time, they spend billions and billions on U.S. military hardware that they don't really need. So, if there's going to be reconciliation, and I'm a little bit skeptical on that. I think a tense truce might be the best we can hope for. But if there's going to be reconciliation, it won't necessarily come from the Israelis or the Palestinians. It will come from the people who have too much to gain from having this just be perpetuated for another 3 or 4 generations. It's the greatest lightning rod for internal dissent any of those Arab dictators were ever given. They're not going to want to give that up.
Well, take it. So I'm curious your view of, so you mentioned the Iranian nuclear. What about the issue that now with the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafis taking hold of Egypt, what do you see as the future of the peace treaty, which is kind of being the bulwark of that region's stability? Is that part of the region?
I would not foresee Egypt going into a conventional war with Israel, no matter what shape their government takes up. I think the Middle Eastern regimes know full well that the nuclear weapons Israel may or may not have would prove decisive if Israel felt that it was facing utter defeat. And let's face it, I mean, think about the enormous empty spaces between the populated sections of Egypt and Israel. That's Egyptian territory. Israelis wouldn't mind lighting that up for 1,000 years. So I wouldn't worry too much about a conventional war between them. And I spoke to an Israeli general about that exact topic about 6 months ago, and he said, if the recent history of the Middle East is any indication, the Egyptian military is going to be way too busy cracking the heads of their own civilians to worry about us. That's a cynical way of looking at it, but he could be onto something.
We'll take the next question from the floor.
My question is, you guys are familiar with Gurney people, he's a political activist that specializes in Islamic extremism. He's written about 4 or 5 books. One of these books is A World Without Islam. And within that book, he does extensive research on the topic of discussion today, looking at political, historical, and a bunch of other issues. He comes to the conclusion that the majority of differences between the West and the East are because of geopolitical issues. So my question to you is, do you think that the world today and the situation between the West and the East would be different or vastly different if Islam didn't exist?
Well, I don't fully comprehend the question. If Islam didn't exist, well, it would be a different world. But the reality, the objective reality is that there is Islam, there is a Christianity, there is Judaism, there are people who, seek their identity and understanding of the place in the context of those religious traditions. So it exists. The issue that we're talking about is more in the realm of politics. There is no necessarily, on the essential aspect of religion, any quarrel between anyone. You know, I don't see God favoring one over the other. You know, I mean, do we have any privileged access to knowing which side God favors? When the sun rises, it rises for all people. But there is a political reality in the Arab Muslim world. They simply became more and more irrelevant and redundant as the Western world and Europe made progress in the great transformation that took place from approximately 1400 to 1800. In this time frame, the Middle East and the Arab world fell rapidly behind. That's where we are today. And how is that the Arab Muslim world is going to come back and make a sense of the world that they inhabit is a huge challenge that they are faced with.
I just want to have an opportunity to maybe restate my question I didn't understand. Do you think that the relationship that exists between the West and the East, the tension, would exist or would not exist if Islamic influences were not present in that region? Do you think that we would be at a different place, you know, in the West and the East if Islam didn't exist?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the Islamist presence and Islamist rise and the Islamist persistence is greatly damaging to the Muslims. The Japanese had to get, you know, free from the militaristic politics and ideology of the Japanese militarists. But it took a war for them to get rid of it and become free, and look where Japan is today. I mean, after all, the United States and Japan fought one of the bloodiest wars of the 20th century. And the irony, Japan won the war. Afterwards, you know, they're all buying Hondas and Seikos and, you know, so on and so forth. There is no problem. The economy is seamlessly intertwined.
I have something to add to that, which is, I think I read an article by the author you mentioned, and the question he raised struck me as unanswerable in many ways. Like, it's just, those kinds of counterfactuals are not really useful for the world that we actually live in. Because you can't just subtract a huge intellectual, it shapes so much of that part of the world. I don't even know how we would eliminate and kind of create a world where it doesn't exist. I don't know how that would be answered. But I have another question I think is worth pondering that's a twist on that, which is, what does the world look like when you subtract individual freedom, science and technology, and free trade? And just the basic rudimentary kind of trade that we see in primitive Europe after the Dark Ages. What does it look like? What happens to science what happens to society when you take away science and technology? That's a really interesting question that you can answer, because we've seen it in the Dark Ages of Europe. And I think a lot of what we're seeing in the parts of the Middle East and the Arab Muslim world that is backward and falling behind where it used to be, is a significant part of that is the absence of freedom, true freedom, individual freedom, the absence of science and learning and the valuing of it, learning about the world, nature, and the absence of true commerce, where there are rules that enable people to create and trade and build. Those are significant issues that if their role in that part of the world were identified, you would also see fewer conflicts, both within and among Muslim nations and Arab nations, and between them and the West. Because a big part of what drives some of the conflict is the lust for power and loot. I mean, that's been true throughout history. And it doesn't take, you don't have to be a Muslim dictator or a dictator using Islam to do that. That's been done throughout history. So those are significant factors that are worth exploring. And we have periods in history that shed light on that. So I offer that as food for thought.
We're going to take two final questions from the floor. Yeah. You've already had a chance to ask a question.
My question is directed to Mr. Mansur. During your speech, you talked about 9/11 and the bombing of London and all that. And I agree with you, they're all talked about the war of Iraq, he said they liberated Iraq. Well, 500,000 people died of that, 500,000 civilians, innocent civilians, and more than 5 million refugees in Iraq. Well, you never talked about it. Is it because it wasn't caused by the Muslims? Like, why did you call it liberty? They brought liberty while they killed 500,000 people, 500,000 innocent civilians.
So what's the question? I mean, Iraq was not liberated from Saddam Hussein's regime?
Well, by killing 500,000 people and the count's still going up, it's not liberty. So.
Well, we go back and replay it, but as a student, I imagine you are a student of Western. One of the things is to study history worldwide. Japan was liberated at a tremendous cost. Japan started the war. The cost was huge. Germany was liberated at a huge cost. So countries, that have to take responsibility, the people who start the wars or who create conflicts, they have to take responsibility. One of the big problems, and that's what I've been pointing out, is the Muslims, Arabs and Muslims, they have refused to take responsibility for their action. They have to begin to take responsibility for their action. That's when the transformation of these societies will start taking place. Because one of the aspects of freedom, the most important aspect of freedom, in fact, is to take responsibility. That you are not a puppet on a string. Saddam Hussein is responsible for what happened. And then the Arab world that fed the jihadis to go and engage in a massacre of the Iraqis are responsible. So once we start taking responsibility, then we can then put things into perspective.
If I could jump in just for a second on that. There is no equivalence between terrorist attacks and military operations. People die, things blow up, people get hurt. There are similarities, but there's no equivalence, because what was the goal of 9/11? What was the goal of the tube bombing? What was the goal of the invasion of Iraq? I do not know what the final death toll in Iraq will be. I do not know objectively, in the end, what Iraq will gain from the invasion will have been worth that cost in blood. I don't know who could even decide the metric in which you would make such an objective determination. But I do know that an attack on civilians to prove a political point is not in any way logically comparable to an attack on a country to change its political system. Iraq was liberated. It was. It was not necessarily liberated well, effectively or productively, and the cost might have been too much. But I don't think we can just say because things were destroyed and bad things happened, the goal was not accomplished. I don't know if it was worth the Americans' effort or time. With hindsight, I would say it was a mistake. But we can't deny the fact that those 500,000 people, or whatever the final tally is, bought Iraq a chance at a new path. Maybe they won't do anything with it. Maybe they'll end up somewhere worse. But I just think it's bizarre to deny the logic and the actual factual basis of what happened. The country was liberated.
We'll take the last question from the floor.
My question is for Dr. Mansur. You spoke earlier about the economic sort of background for Islamic totalitarianism. You were saying that failed states is one part of the equation. But my question is, considering that many of those failed states that fostered Islamic totalitarianism, Ben Ali's regime, Mubarak's regime, Saudi Arabia, a lot of those were considered client states of the United States. So I'm wondering, hasn't the West indirectly fostered that same Islamic totalitarianism that you're talking about?
In some ironic ways, yes, because right now one of the problems which I've been pointing out is that our governments, our politicians, our political and media elite, or academic elite, that we are talking about now in Canada and in the West, generally are either ignorant or hesitant or for other reasons, political correctness, sensitivity, multiculturalism, unable or refuses to make a distinction between Islam as a faith tradition and the political ideology. We see it in our own society. We see it in the people who step forward and speak in virulent languages in England, in America, in Canada, in France, who impose on their own community the manner of behavior that is completely contrary to the very value within which these societies, these communities are living. I'm talking here as a Muslim Canadian, right? So yes, in the long process of history, there were decisions made. I mean, the one that immediately comes forward is the decision made during the period after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. Which coincided also with the hostages taken in Iran. The decision made to support logistically, militarily, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And these Mujahideen in Afghanistan then mutated into the Taliban. So you might say, yeah, in the long run that we supported them. We supported them to fight and defeat the Soviet Union and the West. The West didn't support them to turn around and engage in the activities that we had not come to see since 9/11. So history is a very complex process. The point that one has to come back and ask ourselves, when will the Arab and Muslim countries take responsibilities for their own decision instead of shoving it off and saying, you know, this is all the West's fault. The moment it does that, then it will have made a huge leap historically. The West is involved around the world. And my final thought on this matter, you know, is whether it's Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, all of these countries that are engaged with West, or the terrorists targeting the West, apart from targeting their own people. I have been studying this and watching this. Have you, Matt, come across that these people are targeting China, targeting Russia? They are on the borders, and there are Muslims in those countries, and they are heavily repressed. The Uyghur Turks, I have gone and seen them. I have traveled through that area. I've been in Kashgar, in Urumqi, which is the majority population of Uyghur Turks. I've been in Tibet. I've seen what the Tibetans have been going through. Do I hear any complaints from Muslims about the oppression and the occupation? Or the Muslims themselves engaging in a conflict with these people, with the Chinese and with the Russians? So you have to ask yourself, why did the West? Well, the answer is very complex, and the evening has been already late. And so I won't get into that complex answer. But one simple answer is that the Arab Muslim countries do want to be like the West. They don't know how to be like the West. That's the huge challenge they're faced with.
If I could answer the question, I can answer it very briefly. There is a tendency to try and draw equivalence between the West and our opponents throughout history, whatever they happen to be. The history is long, we face many challenges. Our record is not perfect, but we don't have to be perfect to be right.
We'll take one final question before.
Okay, I know there's a lot of specifics in this answer. Iran's influence on Cuba, and the recent regime in Cuba, Raul Castro. I'll get directly to Palestine, but I think in terms of not too much time because I think everybody wants to go on. Iran's influence on Cuba and their issues with Israel in Cuba.
I study the geopolitics of Latin America quite a lot. Iran has absolutely tried to exert political and military influence in the whole region. Strong ties with Venezuela, any of the regions in the area for military technology, missile technology, even access to uranium deposits. I don't consider their influence particularly significant. The Gulf of Mexico, Latin America, it really is an American lake. American military power can be so dominant there. And when it comes to the political influence, if Ahmadinejad and Hugo Chavez want to hang out together for the cameras, okay. I don't think that's going to be particularly significant over here. I think Iran has the right idea in trying to extend their influence into America's backyard. But look, even the Soviet Union couldn't pull that off in Cuba 50 years ago, and the Iranians just aren't playing in the same league as the Soviets were.
All right, well, thank you, Dr. Salim Mansur. Thank you, Mr.
color into black and white. Under the bedclothes, everything will be alright.